Seriously, you gotta take that kid back to where you found her.
I can't just take her back.
Then send her packing, let her find her own way. Look, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. A partner. Somebody I had to look after. And in this world, that sort of shit's good for one thing. Getting you killed.
It really says something about the brutal nature of The Last of Us, its story, and its world that most major secondary characters Joel and Ellie meet on their trek across America, both good and bad, are dead by the time the game is over. Tess, Marlene, Henry, Sam, David. One of the few characters that manages to survive at the end, to the best of our knowledge at least, is Bill. Like essentially every other character in the game, Bill is a fascinating personality. He has an interesting past, an intriguing relationship with Joel, and is a complicated character, and the time that we do spend with him is truly captivating. He's one of a few characters from the first game that might end up making another appearance in the sequel. Then again, he might not, and in this feature, we're going to take a look at his entire story, from beginning to end. The Last of Us doesn't tell us much about Bill's life before the apocalypse, or even before we first meet him in person. We know that sometime after the outbreak happened and prior to the events of the game, Bill and his partner Frank used to live and operate in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and eventually, presumably because of attacks by the infected or bandits, or maybe even both, the two were left as the only survivors in town. Bill also had plenty of dealings with Joel and Tess, and presumably others in Boston, primarily smuggling food, ammunition, medicines, and often other items to those in the quarantine zone. Sometime before the events of the game, Frank and Bill started growing apart, until eventually Frank left him and disappeared, going off on his own. Bill, meanwhile, shut himself off and hunkered down in Lincoln, rigging the entire town with booby traps. His time alone in town, having to scrounge for survival every day, and the trauma of his split with Frank had a negative impact on him, making him bitter and distrustful of everyone and everything. He begins to believe that he is better off on his own, that connections to other people are a burden and are only good for getting you killed. So his state of mind isn't exactly the friendliest when Joel and Ellie come to him for help. By the time the duo gets to Lincoln, they've already been through a lot. Tess has died, and the Fireflies they were supposed to meet at the Capitol building in Boston have been gunned down by the military. Joel figures if he can get Ellie to his brother Tommy, he might be able to tell them where they can find the Fireflies. But to get to Tommy, they need a car, and the person who can help them get a car is Bill. The moment Joel and Ellie enter Bill's town, things start getting out of hand. They disable and set off many of his traps and are attacked by large numbers of infected, and the more they fight off, the more infected they attract. That ruckus also draws the attention of Bill himself, who arrives in the nick of time to rescue the pair and take them to one of his safe houses, while a ravenous pack of infected gives chase. As soon as they're safe though, Bill, distrustful as always, handcuffs Ellie and forces Joel on his knees. After checking to see if they've been bitten and ensuring that they're both clean, Joel tells Bill that he needs a car. Bill is, at first, hesitant to help him, but Joel reminds him of favors that he owes him. What these favors are goes unexplained, but they're enough to compel Bill to agree. He then tells them that though he doesn't have a car, he can find parts scattered across the town that he can put together to give him a car that will run. During their trek across town, Bill brings up Tess a couple of times, talking about how he doesn't understand why Tess is okay with Joel wanting to help Ellie out, and then expressing disappointment when Joel tells him that this was actually Tess's idea. Joel, of course, doesn't tell him that Tess is dead, perhaps because that's not something he wants to talk about, but also maybe because they don't really have any time for heart-to-hearts. As they make their way across town, they run into a ridiculous number of infected. There are many close calls and many situations where they come up against overwhelming odds, including one where the three of them are forced to fight off a terrifying bloater. Each time they manage to escape alive and relatively unscathed by the skin of their teeth. Eventually, when they're in one of the houses on the other side of town, they find Frank. As it often happens in The Last of Us though, he's already dead by the time they arrive. Frank, it turns out, was bitten and got infected some time back, and he hung himself before he could turn. Before dying, he also wrote a suicide note, in which he expressed how, in his own words, hated Bill's guts. Bill tries to gruffly brush this off, but clearly he's affected deeply, both because of the death of his partner and the poor terms that they were on, to put it mildly, when he died. Something else they find in the garage of the house where Frank had been holed up in is a truck with one of Bill's batteries in it, which Bill realizes Frank must have stolen from him. Bill, Joel, and Ellie manage to get the truck running and narrowly escape one final attack from a pack of infected. Finally, Joel and Ellie drop Bill off back in town. Joel tries to express sympathy about Frank's death, but Bill simply lets Joel know that the two of them are now square, and he no longer owes him any favors. After telling him one final time that Ellie, and having to look after her, is a burden on Joel that will likely get him and herself killed, he tells him to get out of his town, and that's the last we see of Bill. It is, of course, unknown what happened to him after that, and we can't say for sure that he is still alive years later when The Last of Us Part 2 begins, but we can probably assume that he is. Will we be seeing him again? Well, that's hard to say, but given how interesting his character was, and his history with Joel and with Ellie to some extent, it would be great to see him make a return. Either way, with The Last of Us Part 2 merely weeks away from launch, we don't have to wait long to find out whether or not Bill will be back. All we can do at this point is keep our fingers crossed that he does. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.